Yeah, so what's up internet? Synths Media here. And it's a bit of a nest of wiring on my desk here. But what I've done today, and this is just like a first experiment, is I have here my AE Modular down there. I've got here NTS-1, Korg NTS-1. That's always useful to just add some effects to what we're producing here. And most importantly, I've got this Microbit here. As you know, I'm very keen on the Microbit. Amazing little board. There's a lot to this board, and people are sleeping on it, and I just want to show you what I've been doing with it today. So the important thing about this is I've got the connections here. Ground is this black wire, and one is this green wire. They're just crocodile clips at the moment. It's not very permanent, this setup, but that's how you get sound out of this. And you'll see they come around here, and this side they're just connected to an ordinary mini jack. Black one goes to the bottom one. I'm just going into the top for the green one. I mean, it's a stereo jack, so it's going to hum slightly. And then that jack is going into the AE Modular here, input. I've got the sound coming out of there going into my SV filter, which I hope you can see there. And then just coming out of the low pass, going back into the audio, coming out of that, going into the NTS-1. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking the sound output from the Microbit. I'm using the AE Modular just as just for its SV filter. It's the only module I've got currently. And then I'm just taking the output into the NTS-1 for the kind of standard delay, reverb, effects that the NTS-1 can do. So I really just wanted to kind of show you what we can get out of this Microbit. So Microbit is a very small, cheap board, kind of intended for people in schools. Like I say, I think there's a lot to it, and hopefully I'm going to show you why there's a lot to it. This board is, I mean, I bought this for about 12 quid when it came out. This is just the version 1. I think the latest versions are about 15 quid now. So if you're kind of just playing around with a nice little experimental modular type setup, or one of these sort of small things set up, actually don't sleep on the Microbit, because it can do some remarkable things. So I've got this Microbit set up with 3 kind of programs in it, which we're just going to switch between here. The first one is just literally playing random pitches. So that's the kind of beepy sound, and obviously we can filter that sound there. Put some resonance on it. Kind of a harsh sound. Obviously if we went and put a bit of reverb on it. Now, I'm literally just playing random frequencies at this point. In a minute, I'm going to go and show you the code that's in this Microbit. But that's the kind of default sound you get out of it, playing notes. You could play it a bit lower and make slightly bassier notes. But, I mean, this is just to give you an idea what we've got there. But the really interesting thing from my perspective of this is the speech synthesizer it's got inside it. So firstly, I'm going to just play some random, what it calls singing. So that's its speech synthesizer in singing mode, let's say. And again, now it's got, you'll see in a minute, the program is using standard pitches, like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. And that's the words it's kind of singing as well. Again, random. Now, if we start putting some effects on this, let's say. We can change the speed of this. And then the final mode I've got it in, I'm using the speech synthesizer again, but I'm using it speaking, and I've just got some random phonemes or some kind of phonemes that I put in, and I'm playing them at random pitches, random speeds, and this gives you a really quite extraordinary sound, I think. Now, I've just sort of chose these because I like this kind of I like the sound they produced. And because I'm playing them at random speeds each time, random pitches each time, you can hear the kind of variety of sounds we can get out. We can get out of this thing. And of course we can put some effects on this too. This is actually very Boards of Canada sounding, isn't it? I just realised what it was reminding me of. So I've now tidied and simplified this by basically getting this bit of breadboard here, and I've found this is effectively a little adapter which you stick the BBC Microbit into, and it's got these two rows of pins, if you can see that, they just go straight into the breadboard. So I've mounted the Microbit here on the breadboard. I've connected two potentiometers up to it. I'm using the analog inputs. The Microbit has got 5 analog inputs, but one of the analog pins is being used for the sound output, and 2 of them are unfortunately connected to this display here, which means that you can't run the display at the same time as using them as inputs. So I've restricted myself currently to just 2 potentiometers, but that gives me control over 2 parameters, and I can use the buttons on the Microbit to kind of switch between different modes. So still early days, fairly simple setup, but it now at least means there's no crocodile clips and, you know, that much larger sort of wiring. I've still got it fed into the SV filter here in the AE Modular, then it comes through there out into the Korg NTS-1, which is giving me effects, reverb, stuff like that. So I've got 3 modes currently programmed into this. When you turn it on initially, you've just got to calibrate it by turning each of these knobs to its maximum, minimum values. And you might be able to see that little dot now moving around. It's only 5 positions, so you can't get a high resolution thing, but you can just kind of see that you're calibrating it correctly. So the first mode is a simple beep. I'm just going to turn it up. wire's a bit loose here. And in this mode, this is the standard thing, one of the knobs is controlling pitch. And the other one is controlling the speed. And if I turn it above a certain level, I've got it start to play random. It goes into a random mode where it plays random frequencies. And of course we can turn some reverb on. Perhaps turn the filter down a bit. Perhaps give it a bit of phasing here. Obviously with this echo time we've got some obviously the effect add a lot to this fairly simple bleep. But you can see we've got something playable, we can sort of play around. Right, the second mode, we're back in the speech synthesizer, singing. And again, we put some effects on that. We can get some interesting sounds here. And then actually that is, I'm not quite sure what's happened with the calibration there. It could perhaps have played slightly higher notes. But let's go to the final mode where we've got that arbitrary set of phonemes. And speed that up. Go back to that mode. So yeah, first instrument, I guess, made out of the Microbit. So yeah, the Microbit is quite an interesting selection of sounds in it. I'm about to go and show you the code now. It's all written in Python. It's not going to be... I think if we were writing in C, we could get something faster and perhaps do some more sophisticated synthesis in this. And it's a limited board, obviously. There's very little memory to play with. But as you can see, you know, we've got, even with what we've got here, we've got 3 modes, 3 different kinds of things. Couple it, obviously, with the very effective Korg. And I think this is going to play an interesting role in my setup. You can see that what I'm really using the AE Modular for here is there's a hub and a thing providing a constant, providing power to all these, which gives them a common ground. I hope it means they're not going to burn each other out. Well, this Microbit is... I've not tried feeding any signals into it, perhaps like a clock signal, because it's meant to only work with 3.5 volts. But I probably will take that risk at some point, or at least, you know, put a resistor and a voltage divider, perhaps. But yeah, that's where we are with this, and let's go and have a look at the code. Okay, so here we are in our MicroPython editor. The editor is actually in, and the compiler online, so you just have to navigate to the address of this page, and I will drop a link to it in the description. And what you do is you write your code in here, you hit download, you download the compiled hex file onto the Microbit, which looks like an external drive. In a previous video I showed that in more detail. So today we're just going to look at the code, but that will install it on your Microbit, which is connected by USB to the computer at this point. So the standard things, we're going to import the speech library for the speech, we're going to import random for some random numbers, we're going to import the music library, which knows how to play those beeps, time and math, and then the Microbit here is the namespace for the code dealing with the actual hardware of the board. So we're importing pin 1, pin 2, the display, which is that 5x5 matrix of LEDs, the button A and the button B, and a sleep, which happens to be part of Microbit's namespace. This diagram, I'll also put a link to this. This shows the version 1 board, which is what we're using here on the right, and the version 2 board is the more recent one. So when you look at your Microbit, the edge of your Microbit, you have these 5 large pins, which you could say you put crocodile clips on, 0, 1, 2, and then the 3 volts and the ground. Now we are actually taking all the power to this board. It's coming out of that USB module on the AE Modular. So that's how we know that the ground is common between all the devices plugged into the AE Modular. And in fact the 5 volts are also common. But in this case it's feeding into the Microbit, and then Microbit itself adapts that down to 3 volts, and it gives us a 3 volt output and a ground output as well, or a ground connection. So all the components, the potentiometers, the LEDs, etc., they're all getting their power directly from the Microbit, so they're all compatible with it. And we then have the 3 other main pins, which are 0 is where the sound output, and we've just connected a standard that's going straight out of that into the input of the filter. I haven't done anything, it seems to be okay to do that. I've not, at least nothing's caught fire, so I'm assuming it's okay. And that's an analog in out, as you can see. And then 1 and 2, those are also analog pins, analog inputs, and those are being used to take the value from the potentiometers. So that's how we read the pot. And you can see they're marked as 1 and 2, and the code will refer to them as pin 1 and 2. Those are the things we imported from that Microbit namespace. Now there are, as you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 analog inputs altogether on the Microbit. But as I was saying earlier, unfortunately, these pins here, pin 3 is also tied to the LED column 1, pin 4 is tied to LED column 2, pin 10 is tied to LED column 3, and so we can't use those 10, 3 and 4 at the same time as we're using the display to output. And I think something like this, you need a little bit of a visual display. I mean, maybe if we connected some other output pins to LEDs, we might use that instead, but currently those are out of action for us. Finally, pin 0 is the pin that we're actually using for our audio output, so that's not available either. So we're only using pins 1 and 2 for our inputs. So the first major function is scale. Now this is something we're going to use a lot. Scale is a function that's going to take a value which is given to us within a particular range of numbers, and it's going to find the equivalent in a target range or an output range. So let's say we receive a number somewhere in the range 0 to 10, but we want it to represent something in the range 0 to 1000, then low 1 is going to be 0, high 1 is going to be 10, low 2 is going to be 0, higher 2 is going to be 1000, and then scale x is the actual value. So if we receive, say, 3 in that range 0 to 10, it's going to be the equivalent of 300 in that range, 0 to 1000. But this function will work for pretty much anything. So, you know, we might want to scale between 0 to 10 to -5 to +5 or whatever. The reason we use this a lot is because we need to take those values from our potentiometers and scale them into a usable range for something we're trying to control. Now, after a bit of trial and error, two things became obvious. The first is that this function, or this expression, or the formula for calculating, for doing this scale transformation, if for some reason it ends up dividing by the difference between your high one and your low one, okay, the size of your initial range. Now, if for some reason, and you'll see why that might be the case in a minute, high one and low one are the same value, that's going to be zero. The difference between them is going to be 0, and you'll end up with a division by 0 error. So just to short circuit that, initially we test whether low one is equal to high one, and if it is, we short circuit the formula and we just return low 0. Well, you'll see why in a second, why there is a possibility of this. The second thing that we notice is that those potentiometers I'm using actually seem to be logarithmically scaled. In other words, they don't scale linearly. The higher you turn them up, the larger the kind of increments represent in terms of a difference, change in voltage. So we need to take the log of all those values in this initial thing. So we start off here, it's the log of the low divided by the log of the high. Sorry, it's the log of the high minus the low. That gives us the actual size of that range here. We take the value x minus that, so that sort of more or less tells us how far along that range we are. Divide that by the size of the whole range here. That gives you more or less the proportion. So if it's, say, 2 out of 10, it's a fifth, okay, 0.2. That's what this expression is going to give you. And then we're going to find out how that should scale to be in this range. So we'll again take the size of this output range as high 2 minus low 2, multiply the proportion by that. So if the output range is 0 to 1000 and the proportion was 0.2, then obviously 0.2 of 0 to 1000 is 200. And then if that output range didn't start at 0, you want to offset it by the low 2. So we just add the low 2 here. So standard formula, you'll find this in any book. The only things to notice is that just make sure that low 1 and high 1 are different, and if not, do something else. And it's because of the specific potentiometers we're using, we're going to take the log of it. Maybe some other potentiometers would have a linear scale. In other words, the voltage difference would scale linearly with how far you turn them around. Now I'm going to use this a lot in what I call a calibrated parameter. So the point of a calibrated parameter is it's like a little box that's going to store a value that we've read from the potentiometer, but we need to know what are the maximum and minimum values. Now we can't, when you're dealing with electronics like this, you can't just hardwire some numbers. The specific resistances, my ones will be different from the resistances that you might be using. Or I might have to swap it out for another component at some point in the future. I may rebuild this circuit, or I may, make a board and solder a kind of more permanent version of this together. In the code, we can't really be hardwiring magic numbers that represent whose values are to do with the specific hardware. So what we want is some kind of calibration. And so the way I've found to do this kind of conveniently to me is to invent this class called the calibrated parameter. And what the calibrated parameter does is it just starts reading that value from the potentiometer, and you just update the value here, this set method, but it keeps track of the minimum and maximum values of the range that potentiometer had. And so in the beginning of when you start using it, the first thing you do is you're going to turn it the knob right the way round to the left and run the right way round to the right. And what that means is that the parameter is going to see the whole range that's available. And every time you set this value within it, then it's going to it's going to reset the minimum and maximum value. So basically, as you use this parameter, when it starts off, and this is why we had to test the low one and equal to high one here, it starts off, or it could potentially start off with the two being the same. I mean, I try not to do that. I give them some defaults that are very different, but literally the first time we update the value of the calibrated parameter is likely to be the first time we see a value which is both the minimum value it's seen and the maximum value it's seen, so it will treat those two the same. So if we just try and call the scale method based on a range that's got no length, it will fail for us. So how it works is we're storing the minimum and the maximum value here, we're storing the actual value. We also have this we don't necessarily, we'd like to know if there's been a significant change to the user has significantly turned the potentiometer, or if there's just a little bit of a fluctuation in the electricity. And so we kind of have a threshold. I've currently got this set low to 2, but it could perhaps be a little bit higher. And what that means is we only regard the knob as having been turned. In other words, this changed flag is set if it's been moved by an amount larger than the threshold. So what we do every time around our loop is that for these calibrated parameters, we're going to set the value with the latest reading from the potentiometer. This line here, if the abs of x minus self val is greater than the self threshold, that's just making sure it is a significant change. If it is, we set the changed flag to be true, and then we set its internal value to be this argument x. So now we've updated the value of our calibrated parameter. At this point, we also do a test that if the current value we received is greater than its previous idea of the max, we now update the max to include it. In other words, if it's never seen the parameter this high before, we're now going to push the maximum up to that. Similarly, if we've never seen the parameter this low before, we're going to push it down, the minimum down to this value. This is not a perfect algorithm because, for example, if you had some weird fluctuation in the voltage that pushed it way higher than the maximum that this potentiometer would normally deliver, or way lower, then we might miscalibrate this parameter. But as a sort of quick and dirty solution in a couple of lines of code, it seems to work pretty well. As I say, when you turn it on, you just turn both of the knobs to the two extremes, and that pretty much sets the calibration limits. And now we know then that we know what the limits to the range that this parameter can be, and now we know how to scale it to the ranges we want. So I've then got a function here called project to, which is simply taking the low and the high of the target range. And let's give an example. Suppose I want to map the value of the potentiometer onto a position along that, across that 5 LED matrix, in order to kind of let the light give a rough approximation of how far the knob is turned. Well, in that case, I'm going to take whatever the full range of the possible inputs from that potentiometer are and project them into a space between 0 and 4, because there's only the pixels, the pixels only have an x coordinate of either 0, 1, 2, 3 or 4. So we're going to project from, maybe the reading in voltages came from, or in fact the pins tend to give you a number between 0 and 1024. We're going to project that down to be 0 to 5 or 0 to 4. So that's what the project to function does here. Once we've got our parameter that's been calibrated, we can just say, okay, project that into this range here. And then it's simply a call to scale with the min and max values that we've recorded within the parameter to the target low high range. So there's one extra quirk to this, which is sometimes you want to project to something where you really want to make sure you never hit the very top value. And so what I've done is I've created this safe project to, which kind of protects me from accidentally within my thing hitting the highest value. And so it looks exactly the same, but what I do is I'm converting it into an int anyway for these ones. And if I happen to hit targeting, if the value of x as it's projected is exactly the same as the maximum value, I just subtract 1 from it. That just, for example, when I'm projecting this into the space of light of the position of the pixel on the display grid, that prevents me for some reason overshooting and getting a value 5, which will throw an error because there isn't actually a pixel column 5 or a row 5. The rows are 0 to 4 and the columns are 0 to 4 as well. So that's just a slightly safer version of the project to, which I use whenever usually I'm projecting into a space which represents the index of an array or a position on the screen, etc. And the only difference between that is it's just calling the scale. It's just that if x equals the target high, I subtract 1 from it. Get values normal. Is changed is a way of checking if the potentiometer if this change threshold has been reached, so that we can kind of ignore very small fluctuations, and then report just produces a string for diagnostic purposes. So we define 2 calibrated parameters, right? V1 and V2. These are the 2 things that represent our 2 inputted values. Here we have an array called sulfur. Now this is part of the singing, and although it may not have been very clear, what it was actually singing were meant to be the words do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And these strings are some magic I just got from the documentation that represents both the phoneme shape of that and the actual pitch. I don't understand how this is represented at the moment. I will try and learn a bit more about it, but I just copied this straight out of the documentation. But this is an array of the notes in this sulfur representation, and we're going to use that for the version that's singing voice. Similarly, for the speaking voice, that third mode, the actual phonemes I'm using are 4. It doesn't sound like these, but these, when I was playing around, seemed to make those quite interesting sounds. It kind of sounds like I, which isn't what you'd expect from seeing those. Now you could play around and change these and put some other phonemes in instead. So those are going to be used. And what happens is we're just going to step through these in a ring. These names here, pin 1 and pin 2, are system names. They actually come out of Microbit. For convenience, I just happen to rename them pot 1 and pot 2, potentiometer 1 and 2. Mode is what the current mode we're in is. Wait is the default waiting time as we go around the loop. It's basically like a sleep time, but it's used in several cases. The next thing I create is what I call a phaser. Now, a phaser is like a ring in Sonic Pi, or a circular buffer, or a circular counter. Basically, the point of a phaser is, let's say we've got a thing that's stepping through a number of... Let's say we've got something which is the index of an array, and we want to step from 0, 1, 2, 3, but when we get to the top, we just want to wrap around and go back to 0 again. Well, a phaser does that. It's a kind of counter you can keep asking the next value for, and it will always give you the next one up. And when it hits the top, it will wrap round to the beginning. We use a generator for that. So a generator in Python is like a function, but instead of having a return value, it has a yield line here. And the purpose of a generator is, unlike a function, when a function returns, all the memory that was allocated within it, local to it, disappears from the stack and it's gone. A generator is like a function, this sequence of code here, that never really finish, or doesn't necessarily finish. Okay, it might finish, it might not, but when it hits a yield, it returns a value, but it doesn't stop, and it preserves the variable inside it. So here we've got the make phaser function. You'll see we declare, or we create here a local variable called x inside it. This is our counter. It starts off as 0. And the first thing we do is we yield that value, 0. So it's like a function literally that returns a 0 initially. But at this point, yield, where a normal function with a return statement would have just disappeared and finished, this kind of stays in suspended animation, let's say, until we call it again, in which case it then moves on to the next line, which is this while true. And now we're going to go into a loop, an infinite loop, inside this while true. And the first thing we do inside this loop is we are going to increment the value of x, but then we're going to mod it by n, which was the maximum value. So let's suppose we call this with 5. Or what's going to happen is x is going to start off as 0. We're going to increment that to 1, to 2. But when we increment it to be 5, it's going to because it will be modded by 5, it'll go back to 0 again. This is the modulus operator here. And then we just yield that. So what it means is every time we return to get the next value from a phaser we've made, it will give us the counter up to the value n and then round to 0 again, not including the value n. So here I have this faz1 is a call to make phaser, and it's based on the length of phone. So phones, if you remember with the phonemes, if you remember in Sonic Pi, we had this idea of a ring which does the same thing. You know, we just keep saying tick, tick, tick. In this context, we're going to use the keyword next, and it's just going to say first time this phaser 1, because it's based on the length of phones, and phones is currently 4. First, that's a phaser of 4. It's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2. Every time we call it, it will go 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. If you were to just add a few more phonemes in here to make a longer sequence, this code wouldn't need to be changed. It will just grab the new length and it will create a sequence of that length, and this phaser called faz1 will just count through it. So this is all just our infrastructure, really. It's 90%, well, the scale function is very important. The calibrated parameter simplifies, once we've got this class, it simplifies a lot of managing these two parameters, v1 and v2. This is just some data. We call our thing pot1 and pot2. These are sort of global variables. And we make a phaser. This is a useful sort of function to have, and we'll may well go on and use it in various places. But in this context, we're just using it to step through phonemes for the speech. And now we just go into our main loop while true. So now it's an infinite loop. And the first thing we do is we handle our inputs. So button A, if you remember, which comes from here, from the Microbit namespace. These are our left and right buttons on the board. They've got methods called isPressed. So if button A is being pressed, well, actually what we can do with this is we can increase the value of weight. And we simply increase the value of weight by 100. Weight is going to be normally used in milliseconds. So this starts off at 50 milliseconds. We increase it by 100. And then we mod it by 600. And then we add on 50 to that. The idea is basically it's somewhere between 50 and 650 milliseconds. Now, in some ways that's been superseded by where we've got one of the pots spare, like in the bleep mode. I also let the pot 2 control the speed, but in the other two modes we can't change the speed there, so there is this other way of using button A to increment the speed. It's not nearly as nice as using one of the potentiometers, but we don't have a lot of potentiometers to play with. And we just set a pixel that just indicates top left hand corner we press button A. Similarly, button B is for incrementing the mode value within the thing. So we've got 4 modes effectively. We've got the calibration mode, and then we've got, which it doesn't make any sound, so we kind of double up there. That mode is calibrating, but it's also just a silent mode when we want to turn the sound off. That's mode 0. Mode 1 is bleeps, mode 2 is the singing sulfur, and mode 3 is the speech. Similarly, we are getting in our value 1 and our V2. Remember, these are both calibrated parameters, and we just read them from pot 1 and pot 2. And this is for diagnostics. We just print this out. It goes up the serial port, the USB serial, so we can print it out on the computer. Right, now let's get down to the real stuff. We just clear the display to begin with, and now we're going to handle these modes. So we're in one of these 4 modes. Like I say, mode 0 is silent. It doesn't do anything. All it does is set the couple of pixels. It sets firstly a pixel on the top row based on the position of V1, and it also sets a second pixel based on both V1 and V2. So if you remember, when it was silent and we were calibrating, we could use the two potentiometers to sort of steer that dot around the small display. And at this point, you see it's very convenient. We've got the values in V1 and V2. In order to get it into the space of the screen, all we have to do is the safe project to between 0 and 5. So all the work of transforming whatever the values were, whatever the resistances were in our board when we set up those potentiometers, if we change for a different potentiometer, once we've calibrated it, projecting into the space of our tiny display is simply a matter of saying V1, safe project to 0 to 5, and to be V2. That's why we've set things up with this calibrated parameter, because we're going to do that sort of thing all over the code. And so rather than have a lot of ad hoc code doing it, let's just put it in one place in a way that's clear for us to understand. And now we've got a convenient way of using that information everywhere we need to use it. So mode 0 does nothing else except sleeps now for the wait time. Right, if mode equals 1, that's the bleep mode. So we're going to set our pixel for the second row down. And now the bleep mode itself has 2 possibilities. Most of it, the position of the V1 potentiometer corresponds to the pitch. But I wanted also to be able to switch into this part where you could just have it playing random notes as well. So what I decided was to set it in such a way that I firstly project its value into 0 to 1200, and then I say if it's greater than 1000, in other words, if it's in the kind of top 20% position, that's going to give us our randomness. So I say I take this variable called frequency. That's going to be the result of a random, this is the random library here, and I get a random integer between 100 and 1000. This is literally frequency in hertz. So 100 is a pretty low frequency, 1000 is high enough for a kind of beep, and so that's what we're going to get our random notes. Remember, these are not pitches like MIDI notes. These are literally frequencies in hertz, so they can be kind of microtonally separated. Okay, but the normal thing you would do, if it's not in that very top range, is we just take the value, we project it between 0 and 1000, and then the frequency is set to proportional to the position of V1. We also update our weight value according to the position of V2. It's scaled, it's safe projected between 30 and 1000. So that can give us, that's how you saw us using that right hand potentiometer to go between slow and fast. And then we call this pitch function of the music library. Remember, that's another thing we've imported. That's the thing that knows how to play these pitches, beeps. We just say music pitch, frequency, duration equals weight. So we actually make the length of the note it plays also the length of weight, and then we sleep for weight as well. So, you know, when it's very fast, you just get a slight, you know, you're just going to get a blah, 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 blah of different beeps, and they're going to be slightly separated by this bit of sleeping between them. If you turn the weight up, it becomes much slower. Right, mode 2 is the singing mode. We just again set some values. We get now, in this case, we're going to get index value. So instead of calculating a frequency, this time we want an index for this array here. Now there are 8 items in this array line, so it's going to be between 0 and 7. So what we do here is I just do that as a V1 safe project to, in fact, 0 to 8. But remember, that safe project to, if it's actually 8, it will just become 7. So that ensures that we get a number, an integer between 0 and 7. That's suitable for using as an index for this array here. So that's turning our position of our left-hand knob into one of those things. Again, we do the weight is the safe projection of the V2. So again, we can control V2 from that. We now call the speech library sing method, and that takes one of these strings here. As I say, this is magic that comes from the documentation, but it clearly represents some version of that phoneme at that pitch, and these are now more like proper pitches. Okay, these are, if you chain these together in the right way, you ought to be able to get a tune, a more traditional melodic tune out of it. So it sings it, and it also sets the speed to be weight. So there is control over the speed using these. Then again, we sleep for the weight. Finally, mode 3. In this case, we've got 4 parameters to the speech saying something. And those 4 parameters are, well, firstly you give it the actual phoneme you're going to speak. Then there's a speed, there's a pitch, and then there's 2 parameters called throat and mouth, which I guess are like sort of formant synthesis type things. They're kind of giving you different shapes to the speech. Now, you could do a lot more investigation to find out which combinations of throat and mouth parameters sound good. What you can see here is that I'm simply mapping the V1 and V2, the potentiometers, onto the speed and the pitch, and then those are being set as random. They're all between 1 and 255. So in an ideal world, we would have, say, 4 potentiometers, and we would make them all under the control so you could play all 4 of them. Again, because of our limitation, you're only having 2 at the moment. 2 of them have to be left random. But, you know, as an exercise, you could try experimenting with giving control over these 2 from the knobs, and then let these 2 be random. So what we say here is we just use, remember we've had that phaser called phase 1 here, which is just stepping through the indices of this array. All we do here is we pull out the next phoneme. And the way we do that is this method here, or this keyword next, when applied to one of these generator functions, is the thing that gives us the next value that's yielded, and then or steps on until, you know, runs the function again until it hits the next yield and delivers that value to us. So that thing here is pulling out the next index value of that phaser. Phones is just an ordinary array, so you just use that value as the index. That will just keep on pulling out this, then this, then this, then this, then this, then this, rounder. It's like the ring in Sonic Pipe. You just pass all these arguments: speed, pitch, throat and mouth, and then sleep for weight. So there's a lot more we could try and control. There's a lot more we could program. There's a lot more scope for the sort of sounds that this board can make. This has been a very, very simple and a very quick and dirty way of accessing them and giving an idea of what we can get out of this. But any of these modes could be expanded into a complete program, you know, something where we could play arpeggios of chords or generate chord sequences on those beeps, something where we could actually play pitches again in the solfa. And here there's so much to play with. I mean, really, you know, there are just everything you heard in my demonstration is just these 4 phonemes that I thought sounded quite interesting. But you can try all the other phonemes. You can try longer sequences. You can try trying to build up, treating different phonemes more like drum sounds and sort of try and build up rhythms from them. There's a huge amount to explore here. And this is just a tiny, tiny snapshot of some of the possibilities. But you know, I really think this speech synthesizer is amazing. The kind of sounds it can come up with, particularly if you do feed it then into your AE Modular, if you can also feed it through some effects. It's, you know, this tiny 12 quid board I think is really exciting for people who want to get experimenting and hacking with their AE Modular, etc. So I think I've just the video's gone on way too long now, and what I suggest is, you know, the code will be up, and take it, have a play with it. If you've got a microbit and you've got the kind of wherewithal to do this, just start playing with it, plug it into what you can play. Be careful with the power rating. Like I said in my previous video of me starting off with my AE Modular journey, I bought it exactly because I was looking for a sort of almost laboratory workbench to start connecting some electronics experiments to a more convenient musical instrument context. Because, you know, you can just do all this with crocodile clips directly onto your mini jacks and things, but I was looking for something a little bit more robust and workable than that. And, you know, I'm feeling quite happy with how this is evolving. So yeah, a bit of circuit board, a few standard components like the potentiometers, resistors, LEDs. That adapter is very useful. I'll put a link to where you can get those, that lets you plug the microbit into the board. Now, like I say, the microbit you can get 15 quid, the adapter is another couple of 3 quid, everything else standard electronics components. And yeah, to the best of my knowledge, you can just take the output straight into your AE Modular and process it. So this is definitely what I was looking to do with the AE. It gives me a convenient basis in which I can just plug all this other stuff together. So you know, I recommend it. You know, if you're in this world, if you've got AE Modular, it seems to me a no-brainer, right? Just get the microbit to play around with. If you're in Eurorack, I don't know, you know, then it would be a different set of issues, because now it would be all about the power ratings and things. So be a bit more circumspect with that. But again, if you know your electronics, that shouldn't be that difficult. But like I say, I'm scratching the surface here. The amount of sounds you could get out of these things, the potential for making some really weird rhythmical loops, riffs. In a future video, of course, I'm going to look into how we could start synchronizing this with other things. But like I said, there's a lot to start thinking about. So go try it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making it through to the end here. If you're interested in AE Modular, this is just the beginning of my journey, so subscribe to see that. If you're interested in microbits and what else you can do with those, then, you know, I'm doing a couple of videos around it, and now I've got this set up, I'll be doing some more. Like I say, I will be drilling down into each of these ways of generating sounds and seeing what I can do to make it musically both more controllable and playable, and also more perhaps interesting from some certain musical perspectives. You know, clearly You could be making arpeggios of chords and perhaps generating chord sequences. You could be making something that sings real words. You could be, say, making some more sophisticated effects with that. The thing to note is that this program, as is, pretty much maxes out the memory of the Microbit. I have several times with this program added a couple more lines to various bits of it, and it immediately just throws a memory error and says there's no memory left anymore. Now, partly that I think is because using both the speech library and the music library are themselves taking up memory. So if you were to make a program that just used one of them, that would save you some memory. But having this version of the program, it's very, very tight. I've had to fiddle around a lot to get all of this within the memory of the Microbit. So everything now is a little bit of a kind of balancing act negotiation. I add one thing, I have to take something else away just to keep it within the memory. But it's fun, it's interesting, it's a good discipline in some ways, and yeah, there's a lot of fun to be had with it. So as I say, thanks for watching again, thanks for following through with this. Do subscribe if this kind of very geeky hacking in making your music appeals to you. Note that I also do some very different stuff. My series on Protoplug is still going. I am getting back to pure data at some point. There will certainly be more Sonic Pi as well, and other things. So, but you know, if there's code involved in making music, and it particularly if it makes some crazy sounds or some beautiful tunes, then that's what we're all about here. Synths Media, and I'm out.